let me hop into it. So again, chapter 10, Global Inequality. And if you go into the Canvas, I did update these slides recently. So the ones that were up there were outdated. So I did over the past few days update these. So do make sure to download the updated, version of the slides, which has like, more recent data and graphs and resources. So you'll see if you go into the module for this week that the updated PowerPoint will be there. So definitely check that out. But so, okay, of course, global inequality, right? Usually it's talking about the concentration of resources in different nations. And there's obviously so many different types of inequality. This could be, environmental in terms of like emissions. This could be, wealth. This could be other, resources in terms of like coal or oil, or even for today, I'm really going to focus in on like wealth inequality, education inequality, and health inequality. So it's just good to, you know, um, reflect on where we're at in the US compared to other countries and, a critical way so that we can kind of see where we need to improve and where we can improve. So when we look at, first of all, we hear these terms a lot, right, in terms of first world, third world. And these are definitely more so like outdated terms. Usually now we kind of talk about like developed or industrialized countries. And then instead of kind of like the idea of third world, more updated terms might be developing countries, right? So countries that are in the process of economic or social development, low income countries, which is based on per capita income. And I'll show you kind of this map where they use these terms in terms of like low income, lower middle income, high income countries. We also have the term global south, which of course is more geographically based, but usually considering or referring to less developed countries. And then also emerging nations is definitely a better term instead of third world. So in terms of a couple of things that I have here, we have this article, which has a few graphs that I would definitely recommend looking at. Like this one's kind of interesting in terms of comparing developed or developing countries. And so you can definitely check that out based on like population. And then I think this one also kind of whatever talks about some of the updated terminology that's preferred. And then, but yeah, in general, I would say that this kind of like World Bank group, it does a really good job with graphs and terminology. And then they also, in terms of, the low income, lower middle income, I think this link right here shows us, shows us the you can see at the top, dark green is high income, light green is upper middle, pink is lower middle, purple is low income, and then anything gray is not classified. But we can see here kind of like the development and changes over time. But we also notice that the US stays dark green in terms of high income, right? We're considered a wealthier country. But we can also see kind of the development of other countries over time. So this is a good source to use in terms of looking at like income level and comparing that by country. I also think, why is it freezing right now? There's other ways to look at it in terms of charts. So in general, again, this is also the World Bank um, sources, and I would definitely recommend checking this out. You can see like what countries have changed in income category. You see Guinea and Zambia have gone from low income to lower middle. We see that Indonesia, El Salvador, Gaza went from kind of lower middle to upper middle. Jordan, on the other hand, seems like it's gone down a bit. And then we see, Samoa, Guyana going from upper middle to high income. So, of course, there's shifts over time, whether that's going positive or negative. So we have those that I think are good sources. Again, in terms of defining these terms and looking at changes over time. We also just have this kind of like stagnant chart that I put here in terms of the GDP per capita in 2024. And we can see again that, the US has really high purchasing power compared to other countries. And this is important because when we go into health and poverty and education disparities, it's interesting that, we're a wealthier country, but we aren't doing super well compared to other developed and wealthy countries. But we have, we have the money, we have the resources. But again, we don't, that you would think that would be kind of higher ranked in terms of, poverty, education, and healthcare. But I also wanted to show you one more source that I think is interesting. Where'd my thing go? There's also this really cool website called the Carbon Map, and you can just go into Google and click on Carbon Map. I want to show you this video. Someone give me a thumbs up. I don't know if you'll be able to hear it. My goal is that you will be able to. So give me a thumbs up if you can hear this. No? Okay, that's fine. Okay, that's okay. I still recommend going on to just go into Google and do the carbon map and watch just this little video. I think it's like a minute and a half that kind of explains how to use this graph, but it is interesting to play around with and look at, which countries have the wealth, which countries have, larger populations, and also interesting to look at like which countries have the most like emissions in terms of like CO2 emissions from fossil fuel, and then also comparing that to kind of like the people who are at risk or people who are in poverty, or looking at even like the sea level rising. So, kind of looking at consumption, and again, like extraction and emissions, but who that is actually more so like impacting. So definitely do play around with this map. I think that it's helpful in terms of kind of environmental inequity. But back to our little PowerPoint, going to move on into poverty. Okay, so some of the stuff we've already talked about in class in terms of kind of relative, really what we talked about in class was relative deprivation, absolute deprivation, and the standard of living, right? So I'll just recap this really quickly. Absolute deprivation is talking about not having access to like food, water, clothing, shelter, like I think of it of the things that we absolutely need to survive. So absolute deprivation is when we don't have access to those things. And then relative deprivation has more to do with the standard of living within a particular society, right? We talked about this in class in terms of, in the US, it is the standard to have a cell phone. It is the standard to have access to Wi-Fi or have a refrigerator or, somewhere that you can do laundry. So again, relative deprivation is more so relative to the standard of living in a particular society. We also then very similarly have relative poverty, extreme poverty, and subjective poverty, which are very similar to, absolute and relative deprivation. So, relative poverty is when, you're in a society where you're unable to live the lifestyle of the average person in that society, right? Very similar to relative deprivation, right? Extreme poverty, also kind of like similar to, or they're saying more likely to be used now instead of absolute poverty. But again, where you're barely able to afford basic necessities. And then subjective poverty is more so, yeah, multidimensional when we're looking at how maybe someone's income, again, within a particular society, meets the levels that we need to, which is what I want to talk about in terms of like poverty in the US, and kind of the poverty or the federal poverty line in the US. So federal poverty line, of course, is usually updated every year, every couple of years in terms of, the poverty line is important because if you don't meet the poverty line, that is what allows you to have access to, certain assistances, whether that is, food stamps or rental assistance or whatever, right? I think I have a list more so here, right? So if your family makes over the federal poverty line of 2025, which is $32,000, you're no longer eligible for Medicaid, food stamps, EBT, rental assistance, other kind of like childcare programs that help you out. And so that's why this is important. And I kind of want to get into how it's a little bit whack, right? So I'm going to base most of my kind of analysis on a family of four. So we see that in 2025, the federal poverty level for a family of four is $32,000. And I do think this is interesting. Typically, we don't consider this, but Alaska and Hawaii have different poverty levels or poverty lines because you got to think like they have to import a lot of things, right? Whereas if you're kind of on the mainland, the imports and exports and trying to get access to different, I mean, thinking like about like food or certain things like that, are easier to kind of ship and transfer within the US. And again, more expensive to buy certain things in Alaska and Hawaii because again, things need to be shipped in or flown in or whatever. So, but again, for the most of the US, are at $32,000 for a family of four. We do see that this has gone up. In 2019, it was 25,000. In 2022, it was 27,000. 2024 was 30. Well, this is actually 2025. Um, yeah, I meant to write 2025, but it's all good. So we do see that the poverty line goes up, and as it should because of inflation, but it still is too low in my opinion, right? Another main thing to think about is that when we think about people living in poverty, most of them are not unemployed, and that's why in the US we kind of say like the working poor because most people in poverty are absolutely working, right? They're just not making enough. Another thing that I need you to keep in mind and consider is that also most of the people in poverty are children. So when we do kind of look at maybe the unemployment level, we have to keep in mind that a lot of the people in poverty are under 18. And so, it definitely throws me off when people are like, they just need to, get a job and work. And it's like, again, most of the people suffering from poverty and deep poverty in the US are children. So kind of just to put this in perspective about, again, $32,000 being the poverty level or the poverty line, whatever, for a family of four. Looking at stats in Maryland, the average rent is right about $2,000 a month, which would bring us to $23,000 for the year. The average cost of childcare is 11 to 17,000. It depends on, what source you look at, but of course the quality of care, etc. But again, if we're thinking about a family of four, and if we're being generous and we're just saying that childcare is $10,000 a year, that's $20,000 for childcare for two children, right? At least. When we look at the average cost of groceries, it's about 348 a month for one person, but 1,343 for a family of four, which brings us to about $16,000 per year for groceries for a family of four. And then if you look at like the average cost of utilities, which you also need in terms of water or gas or electric, um, we're looking at about $5,000 per year, right? So when I add these things up in terms of the cost per year, it brings us to about $56,000. And that's obviously not including extras, or some of these things I wouldn't even consider extras, right? In terms of, let's say, like clothing or needing new shoes, or I even think about like, especially like toiletries for women. Um, Even like, think about like having younger children and kids grow really quickly and need new clothes and new shoes very often. So again, this is just $55,000 on average, again, in Maryland for a family of four. So again, when we think about, the poverty line being 32,000, if you make over that amount, again, you're no longer eligible for aid. So where this gets frustrating is like, let's say that, you and your partner together, let's say each of you make $20,000 a year and therefore you make $40,000, you're over the poverty line, therefore ineligible for aid or ineligible for aid, but still cannot afford the basics to survive. Or not, I guess, to survive, but to, well, yeah, to have shelter and food and clothing. So yeah, I would say very close to absolute poverty, right? Like this is just the amount that you need to have the basic shelter and food for a year. And so that's why we consider there to be a problem with the poverty line and why I think that it needs to be higher. And this kind of goes into the like welfare queen trope, which really targets Black women who are more so like low income and impoverished, who quote unquote take advantage of welfare, right? So it's kind of this trope that, oh, like, you see Black women with a lot of like kids and they're just sitting there taking advantage of welfare. But again, when it comes down to it, like again, let's say that you have two kids and therefore childcare is, me being generous, let's say $20,000 for the year. Ooh, that's like most of the 32, like that leaves you with like $12,000 left over for these other things in terms of groceries and utilities and rent. And again, the average rent is $23,000 a year. So when you think about that, it's like, okay, so am I going to go to work to make, let's say even $50,000 a year and then spend, 20,000 of that on childcare and not be eligible for aid? Or is it just smarter to stay at home, raise your kids yourself, and, be able to take advantage of the aid and assistance that hopefully you should get from the government. So again, it's interesting when people are like, oh, just go get a job, and it's like, yeah, you can get a job and make slightly over the poverty line and then again be ineligible for aid and therefore spending also a lot on childcare. So in general, I would just say that we need to increase the federal poverty line or maybe even have it state by state, based on kind of math like this in terms of what the average person in that state or even county needs to cover the basics. And the poverty line should be at least that, in my opinion. So another thing that is like a misconception is I hear a lot of people who are like, well, poverty in the US isn't that bad. But that's where we kind of go back to like the relative, or absolute or subjective poverty, where, again, to live a decent life in the US, yeah, the standards are having like a cell phone and a refrigerator. And, we talked about this in class on Monday, I'm pretty sure, but the high cost of being poor, right? And how being poor is expensive, right? And how people, you'll get charged if you go, if your bank account goes negative, or, not having access to a refrigerator or a freezer is going to cause you to, deter away from healthier foods and have to be, pushed towards buying, canned foods and things that have more preservatives in them, which of course has a, big health impact on people who are impoverished. So whatever, I just also wanted to bring up that like it depends on the way that you look at it in the source, but we see about 11 to 13% of Americans are in poverty, and of that 11 to 13%, 34 of them live in deep poverty, which is as of right now classified as less than 29K for a family of four. In terms of child poverty, we rank number three. Again, most of the people in the US in poverty are children, and a lot of them are also in deep poverty. This one's just kind of a video that you can look at in terms of addressing the misconception that, or yeah, addressing the misconception that our, the poor people in the US are just doing so great and we should be grateful compared to like other countries who are, developing nations. And again, it's just a different comparison between like absolute poverty and relative poverty. If we look at poverty rates in the US again compared to other countries, this one's 2011, so I need to update this one, so my apologies, but we see you can consider it two ways in terms of before taxes or after taxes, but we do see that like again for the US compared to other countries, um, not that we're like the absolute worst, but if we look at like after taxes and transfers, we do have the highest percent of people in poverty. Also kind of looking at, I kind of cut off some of the key for this one by accident. I don't know what year this was. I think I tried to get a more recent one. But looking at again relative versus deep poverty here and seeing that, in the US, the percentage of people in relative and deep poverty is higher than comparable, wealthy developed nations. So then popping into like healthcare and universal healthcare and what the impact of that is, we see that, 72 out of 195 countries have universal healthcare. So it's not like rare for, developed nations. And we see that of developed countries, the US is the only country that does not have universal healthcare. And this has a lot of consequences, right? So we see that first of all, not having universal health care is really expensive. So in 2023, the average cost of health insurance was 24,000 per year. And then we also see that the average person spends about 5% of their income on out-of-pocket medical bills. So not health insurance, but like medical bills. And maybe that's having to take an ambulance, which I know is super expensive, or, any sort of like emergency, again, like medical bills that you have to pay for that insurance doesn't cover, whether you have insurance or not. We also see, like, we've seen this consistently over years in terms of, a lot of research is that countries with universal health care fare better in terms of the life expectancy is higher, there's lower mortality rates, and residents are more likely to seek and receive preventative care, right? And again, mortality is referring to rate of death, whereas when we talk about morbidity, we're kind of talking about rates that people kind of get sick or ill. And so, the preventative care thing is really important as well. And I think that contributes to how much people have to spend on healthcare in the US. Because it's so expensive, a lot of people won't seek preventative care, right? They usually, like, low income and impoverished communities or families tend to wait until something is so serious, till their ailment is so serious, at the point where it's like unavoidable to actually go and seek care, which of course is long term going to cost more money at that point to address. And also, you're going to catch things in later stages. Being in stage one versus stage three cancer, if you have preventative care or access to preventative care or can afford preventative care, you can adjust that issue earlier on before it's detrimental to your life, or hopefully be able to address that before it's too late too. When we look at life expectancy, compared to other like wealthy countries, we see that the US has the lowest life expectancy rate, right? So in the US, the average life expectancy is 76.1, and we see that kind of all other, developed and wealthy countries have at least 80 as the life expectancy on average. We also see that per capita, we spend the most on health and healthcare. So, there's a misconception that, oh, it would be so expensive for, universal healthcare, but realistically, we spend the most on healthcare and we have the lowest life expectancy. So, of course, I think, having universal healthcare would increase our life expectancy and the overall kind of expenditure on healthcare in general. So we need to do better there. When we think about kind of like COVID, we saw that in the US we had this one's kind of like hard because we're talking about like total deaths, right? Where of course there's like a lot of people who live in the US, but but we also had the most amount of like excess deaths. And by that we're kind of referring to the fact that like there were deaths that were avoidable, that yeah, that we have like one of my big things is that in the US, like we have the resources, we have the ability, we have the doctors, we have great education, we have great quality of medical care, right? We have the resources, but we largely like due to, capitalism and other things, uh, don't really, or people aren't able to take advantage of that, right? Like we have enough resources and the medical experience and expertise to make sure that everybody who needs an EpiPen can have an EpiPen, or people who need insulin should be able to afford that. Like these basic things, um, kind of like insulin or like an EpiPen, are incredibly expensive. And it's not because it's rare or hard to make. It's just because they know that, that people need those things and therefore we can charge a lot for them. And so let's say that somebody needs an EpiPen, but, and they have an allergic reaction and they don't have them because it was too expensive. That's an excess death. Like that's an avoidable death, right? And so you can kind of apply that to COVID in terms of we have we have the quality of care. We have the ability to provide everybody quality care. And that goes back to the fact that we're one of the wealthiest countries, right? Like we have the resources. We just, again, um, don't don't seem to care about community and care more about profit. I do want to recommend this film. Do I already have it up here? No? Okay. One of the films for your upcoming assignment is called Totally Under Control, and I really recommend this one. Essentially, it's about totally under control is a quote from Trump saying, when it came to COVID, we totally have this under control. Don't worry, right? Like we really minimized the problem and said that it was fine. I think that people were afraid of scaring people and creating a frenzy, but I think that people, in any society deserve to know what's going on and be informed so that they can make their own decisions about their health. Um, and so another like big thing is that, um, where was I going with that? I was trying to say that. Oh, yeah. Well, another interesting thing in this movie is that they're comparing different countries and how prepared they were for any sort of epidemic or pandemic. And most other countries or developed countries had some sort of protocol that they already had developed that they were able to follow when it came to the COVID pandemic, right? And in the US, it's interesting, we didn't have an established protocol. So we were kind of making it up as we went. And therefore, again, we weren't prepared when again we had the resources and intelligence to be prepared for something like this. So again, that's when we kind of see like these excess deaths that were unavoidable. And yeah, so I digress. I definitely recommend watching that film though. I think it's for the next discussion board, and if not, it's for the fourth one. But I would definitely like of the options, I would really suggest that one. It's really interesting to see how, we as a country responded to COVID compared to other countries. But moving on from like health to education, we see that the US like we do okay. Like we're not bad. You know what I mean? But we are ranked 31st in terms of education. And so this is a more so interactive link if you want to kind of come into this and look at again education rank. And we can also see literacy rank, which I'll do in a second. But in terms of looking at our rank compared to others, the top five in terms of education, we have South Korea, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Slovenia. I don't know if I'm saying that right. But then this is kind of the rank in terms of 2024 of all countries. And again, it's not like we're like towards the bottom or anything, like we do fine, but we're ranked 31st. And again, going back to the fact that we do have the wealth in our country and the resources to kind of address this and do better. So again, not horrible, but definitely we could do better, and it's something that we should try to do better on. If we look at the literacy rate, this one's kind of annoying. We don't have as much data on this one. Um, but the top five in terms of literacy is Andorra, Ukraine, Cuba, Barbados, and Moldova. And so I do in the slides have our literacy rate as a country as of 2024, which is I saw 79 and 80% in a couple of different sources. So let's just say 80%, which doesn't sound horrible. But compared to other countries, and this is the education rank, but look at the literacy rank over on the side, right? You see 100, 97, 92, a lot of hundreds, a lot of 98s, a lot of 99s, 97. Um, you see a 71 in Nepal, which is pretty low, but a lot of these are, above 95%, other than some outliers. So it is just interesting compared to other countries why ours is so low. Um, and, I have a few ideas there. Does anybody want to make any suggestions as to why they think that our literacy rate might be so low? Maybe a tricky
We
one.
don't read.
Yep. Why might we not read as much?
In my 4 years of high school, we didn't get a physical book.
So I think that there's a few factors there, right? So first of all, I think COVID, like everything moving online, right? Like I think you were less likely to, like you said, pick up a book, especially if you're going to school during COVID, right? There's a lot of online whatever. I think, yeah, less books, right? And then I also think that, like, we need to increase funding for public schools so that they can have, more books and updated books and quality books. I also think that this could have to do with, ratio of teacher to students, which is increasing. I had a student in my last class who said for her public school, the ratio was like 40 to 1. So there's 40 students per teacher. So therefore, students are less likely to get individualized attention. So we need, more better funded education. We need to incentivize teachers more too, right? Like we overwork and underpay teachers, so they might have less energy and again, less time if that student to teacher ratio is so high to be able to focus on individual students and help them out. Again, addressing their like unique needs. I also think, of course, there's an aspect when it comes to family and being at home and reading with your children. But I think that that goes back to, again, being overworked, underpaid, and, us working so much that we're exhausted, right? If you're working a job or two jobs and you come home, like maybe you're feeling too tired to read with your kid, or also even keeping it really basic, less money to afford books you know what I mean? Or even I think, if you're more affluent, like again, you can afford to get more books. You can also maybe afford to get a tutor if your kid is not doing well in terms of reading. But so I think that this comes down to a lot of things, a lot of them relating to money, again, like funding, um, quality teachers, or, making it so that there's more teachers per student, there's more individualized attention for students. And again, not working people so hard to the point where, they can't, they get home and I see this, I think I see this a lot. I also think social media is a big one, in terms of we're more likely to consume something that we can just kind of visually scroll through. And, if you can look up, and this is a positive and a negative, right? But if you can kind of look things up and have someone verbally explain it to you, you might not need to go into a book and read about that. And on one hand, that's a fantastic thing, right? Like, um even me, like I like to read too, but like I really, in terms of being a learner, like I like when people explain things to me verbally, especially if you can kind of bring in different stories and anecdotes. And I do think that it's positive in terms of it is making certain education and perspectives more available for people. For example, even if you do have dyslexia and struggle with reading in that way, like it can be really helpful to be able to look something up and have someone explain it, whether that's a TikTok or an audiobook or a podcast. So, and again, I think audiobooks are positive things. If you struggle with reading, if you have ADHD, if you have dyslexia, and you can just listen to an audiobook, like that's fantastic and that's helpful. But again, I think that it goes both ways in terms of that can be beneficial for people who have certain learning disabilities, but then it also kind of enforces the fact that we don't need to read as much, right? Like there are other ways to kind of get information, that you don't have to read for. So again, positive and negative. So I think it has to do with a bunch of different factors. And we do see that, like, in general, the literacy rates continue to go up steadily. You can see like the progress of global literacy, like globally, more and more people know how to read and we have higher literacy rates. So we are moving like in a positive direction. So like that's cool. But in the US, there are some sources that say that as of more recently, our literacy rates aren't necessarily increasing, but more so like stagnant around that 79, 80, 81%. And I do think that like recent stagnation has to do with, all the things I just talked about, but especially like COVID on top of that. And again, everything moving online. And like you said, like not really being given physical books or being incentivized to read physical books. Even just having, I don't know if y'all still use this, but like even having like Spark Notes, right? Being able to just read the summary online rather than having to actually read the book, right? Um, and even like having ChatGPT, like you could just be like, summarize this book for me, right? And they can do that so you don't have to actually read the book, right? So I think that there's a lot of different things in terms of tech and funding and education and again pandemics that have, yeah, again, I don't think that the literacy rate is going down, but I think it's staying pretty consistent. There are some sources that say that there's decline in some areas, and this does make sense to me, especially when we look at kind of the literacy. This isn't literacy rate in terms of this chart. This is the percentage of the state population that read below a fifth grade level. And we do see here, certain trends in certain parts of the country. And we see, like in the South, that there's a larger amount of people who, again, read below a fifth grade level. And I think that that has to do with, quite a few factors. Does anyone have any like guesses or suggestions or thoughts as to why maybe like in the South the literacy rates are lower?
Less technology because they're like in the country.
That's fair. You could say maybe Wi-Fi, and I think going even based off of that in terms of like maybe it being more rural. Um, like for me, I have 5 libraries near me that I can get to via a bus, within 20 minutes. So if you live in a more rural area, I can assume that it might, like your closest library might be farther away. It might be harder to get there. There might not be public transportation to get there. And again, also looking at like even funding for those libraries and school libraries. And something that I think about, and this is just kind of like a whatever, kind of like a hypothesis or a theory in my head, is that I think book bans are also impacting this. And, these are more so areas like especially Texas and Florida are at the top when it comes to book bans. And I can imagine maybe like being a kid and hearing and seeing about all these book bans and being turned off by reading, right? And maybe being like, what, you know what I mean? Maybe even subconsciously just kind of like, wow, like all these books are being banned. So a library might be more intimidating, or again, there might be limited options as to what you can read or the quality of what you can read. Um, and maybe there's things that you're interested in that are, there's so many. I found a list recently. I wish I linked it, but to all the books that have been being banned, and it's like thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands, even if it's something like even as simple as like a fantasy book that might address sexuality too much. They'll take that out of the school library. So I think that like book bans also has a impact here. And again, I would also go back down to funding, because as we know, public schools are funded by property tax in the area. So if you live in a more low income area, the school's going to have less funding, and therefore the library probably has less funding as well. And so therefore maybe the books are outdated, or yeah, outdated and not of interest to the student. So just having less access and less option to books, and even like you said, possibly Wi-Fi, which would help you access audiobooks and stuff like that. So yeah, so there's definitely quite a few reasons. I would have to look into it more as well, but I think geographic location and access to, public libraries, or even just having your school library being funded well would impact the literacy rates. Like I said, as a globe, we're doing better in terms of literacy rates. Where are we? We're up here. So, we fare decently. But I do think that in terms of literacy and it being only 80% is again not terrible, but we could do better. And that's the point, right? Like I'm not saying that we're horrible. Like I'm very grateful to live here where we have the resources and opportunities that we do. But since we are such a wealthy country, we should be able to, or we should try to aim to address these issues, right? But of course, as we know from the video that we watched on wealth inequality on Monday, that, on one hand, we're a very wealthy country because we do have most of the world's like millionaires and billionaires. So there's a lot of wealth here. But as we kind of just said, like, you know, at least 13% of the population lives under the poverty line. And you also saw how there's like a very small and waning middle class, right? Most people are kind of leaning towards the low income side. And, there's just a big disparity in terms of we have a bunch of, really, or not even a bunch of really rich people. We do, we have a lot of the world's like, millionaires and billionaires, but it's a very few people in society who have most of the wealth, right? So I think, y'all remember the video on that from Monday. And if you didn't watch that, then definitely go into YouTube and look at kind of like the wealth gap in the US. Let me bring it up really quick so you can see if you were not there. If you go on wealth inequality in America, make sure that you watch. This one's shorter, but it's from 12 years ago. And this one is the more recent one from 1 year ago, where he addresses the things in this map, but kind of updates you with some of the stats. So if you weren't here on Monday, make sure that you do watch this video. It was well done. Um, but yeah, so again, it's interesting to see how wealthy our nation is, but to see how many people in our nation are not wealthy. Like most people are absolutely not, right? So I
Professor
don't,
Alec,
yeah.
I'm sorry. Is it called Wealth Gap on YouTube or is it called
No,
something else? I wasn't there.
no, you're so fine. So if you go into you can go in, what I usually do is put wealth inequality in America or wealth inequality in the US, but this is the video
Okay.
that you're looking for. I can put the link. Oh, let me put the link in the group chat, because this is definitely like
Okay.
a staple. You know what I mean? I always show this to like all of my classes because I think that it does a good job explaining just how, you know, how crazy the wealth gap is. Like we all know that it's pretty bad. Oh, oh wait, I can hear it. Stop, stop, stop. Okay. I'm like, okay, chill. But yeah, definitely do check that out. So you can see just how crazy the wealth gap is. We have, a lot more people in poverty than we do even like in the middle class, right? So the disparities there are quite stark. So do check that out. And then otherwise, I really only have two more slides that I wanted to talk about in terms of like modernization theory and dependency theory. So with modernization theory, I feel very like iffy about this one. So modernization theory is just saying that like low income countries could improve their economic standing by industrialization and shifting cultural attitudes towards work. So the way that I interpret this, and you might differently, is like it just sounds like, more affluent countries being like, well, if you just industrialized and worked harder, then you would be wealthier. You know what I mean? It's giving very much like meritocracy. And it's like, well, of course, if people, worked more and industrialized the country, that they would develop. That's kind of like, obviously, like, it's like that's what a developed country is, or like an industrialized country is there's industrialization and maybe a different like cultural attitude about work. But again, even like what work is or what hard work is subjective. And again, we talked about that on Monday. But this theory is very much like, it feels like a circular argument to me where they're like, well, you would be more modern if you would just modernize. And so, one of the important points that I want to bring up here, this is a book that I had to read in grad school by Walter Rodney. And if you want to borrow it, let me know. But I definitely recommend it's a thick book, but it's a good one. But I think even the title of it is really important in terms of how Europe underdeveloped Africa, right? We have to think about colonization. We have to think about globalization. We need to think about, wealthier countries going in and taking resources from underdeveloped or developing countries. So we need to stop kind of almost like victim blaming underdeveloped countries and think of it as wealthier countries underdeveloping, you know, um, well, now it's like I'm using the same words, but we need to think of it as something that's happening to underdeveloped countries. Like we are as wealthier nations, moving in, taking, and just exploiting, again, low income countries that maybe don't have the resources to even like defend themselves regarding that. But I do think that it's something that is happening to lower income countries, and it's not that they are just, you know, I feel like when I look at like the modernization theory, it really is very much giving like, well, if you just worked harder, you could be an industrialized nation too. So very much kind of like victim blaming or, kind of going off of the like the meritocracy myth that if you just work hard, everything will be okay, right? And kind of being like, well, you just don't, have certain attitudes or values about work that we do, right? So it's very centered on the perspective of the wealthy and what the wealthy think that they should do. So this one gives me the ick a little bit, whereas this one makes a little bit more sense to me, and this is just my bias, right? But dependency theory. So this one is saying global inequity is due to the exploitation of peripheral or semi-peripheral nations by core nations. And I feel bad I did kind of skip through that terminology, but I know that it's up here. Yeah. Core nations are more so dominant capitalist countries. Peripheral nations, think of things on the peripheral, right? Nations on the fringes of the global economy, dominated by core nations with very little industrialization, whereas semi-peripheral nations are kind of in between, not powerful enough to dictate policy, but they typically are a major source of raw materials, and that help make wealthier countries wealthier, right? Like we're going to go in and take your resources to make us wealthier while making it harder for you to amass your own wealth, right? So it's just one of those things where it's like the rich are taking and getting richer, which simultaneously is exploiting and keeping underdeveloped countries underdeveloped, right? Like we can't just again look at them and be like, you should just work harder and then you would be rich like us because we are taking from them and taking their resources and then using it to amass more wealth on, the side of the people and the nations that are already wealthy. So those are just some things to think about. Again, I did post the updated slides if you want to kind of click into some more of these like resources and look at some of these maps in more detail. I definitely encourage you to do, of course, your own research when it comes to stats and maybe other inequalities that you are interested in. But I do think it's important to compare or at least think about the US where we are in context to like other wealthy industrialized nations. Because again, not, hating on the US, but if we care about the US, we should really be able to look at where we stand and where we need improvement. And that's going to be the first step in terms of being able to improve, certain conditions in the US, whether that's, education, health, or poverty. So those are my main points for today. Does anybody have any questions, thoughts, or comments?